Hello and welcome to another tutorial in the CSS series. In the previous tutorial, we spoke about what combinator selectors are, and then we went over the first two of the four combinator selectors. In the current tutorial, let's talk about the last two combinator selectors. So these selectors are based on a sibling based relationship. As you can see, the first two are based on the parent-child relationship. So the first sibling type relationship selector is called as adjacent sibling selector. What this means is we are going to use a selection. We are going to make a selection on an HTML element based on its sibling. So we are going to use a sibling. So I think it's easier to explain it with an example. So let's write some markup here, some markup as in HTML. I'll be adding a paragraph and I will be adding spans. All right. So let's say we have four different spans which are followed by a paragraph under a div element. Now I want to select this span element. If I want to style this span element, which is the first span element among the four, um, then I would I could use this paragraph because it's a sibling of the span. It's actually sibling of all the spans, but let's say hypothetically, if there is a situation where I want to style only the first span, then I would use the adjacent sibling selector. For that, what I would be doing is I'll start with the adjacent sibling, which is the paragraph in this case, and then add the actual element that I want to style. So the CSS is going to find that combination throughout our HTML page and it's going to find it here. What I'll be doing here is add a color and give it a unique color, where we could differentiate it between this span and the rest of the other spans. After saving this, let me go back and refresh. As you can see, the first span has a different color when compared to other spans. What this says is the combinator selector with an adjacent sibling uh, pattern did work. So it was able to select the span using a paragraph sibling. All right, now let's talk about another type of sibling selector, which is general sibling selector. A general sibling selector is where we want to add stylings to all the siblings based on a specific sibling. So again, it's easier to explain it using an example. So I'll create another div, add a same structure. In this case, let me try to differentiate. Okay, so let's go with the whatever we have so far. So this is paragraph 2, and then uh, let me add some text which is going to differentiate it from the previous spans. So I'll say this is general span 1, general span 2, 3, and 4. Now let's go back we haven't added any general sibling selector styling so far. And if we go back and hit refresh, as you can see, it did apply the same rule that we have for adjacent sibling selector, uh, which where we used in the previous div. So this is bound to happen because a CSS selector is going to be applied to wherever there is a combination of span followed by a paragraph immediately. That's where it's going to add that styling. But just to differentiate between these two divs or the selectors, what I'll be doing is I'm going to add an ID to this and append the ID to the adjacent selector paragraph so that it's going to apply this rule only to this paragraph within this div. So let's go back and hit refresh. So what we told to the CSS is style a span, immediate span sibling of a paragraph which has an ID of para1. So that's what we did. So find a paragraph with an ID para1 and then style an immediate sibling or an adjacent sibling, which is a span, and have added a color of aquamarine. So that's what it is. Now, as per the definition of general sibling selector, if I want to add if I want to add styles to all the spans, not just the first span, then I would be using a general sibling selector. So the way I do that is by using a tilde symbol, and I would add span, and the color will be, let's give a contrasting color to our background, maybe yellow. All right, so let's go back and hit refresh. It did add yellow to all of our spans, but if you notice, it also added it to the other spans. So that's because we are not identifying this paragraph as a unique paragraph, and it's going to be applied to the rest of the spans as well. Although we have a unique ID, we only have a rule for an adjacent paragraph, adjacent sibling selector with a unique ID. That's why it had applied it to the first span, but the general sibling selector will still be applied to the rest of the spans because they they still belong to they still have a sibling relationship to a paragraph, right? So this selection or this rule is still valid. So what I'll be doing is I'll be adding another identifier to this called para2 and only add the general sibling selector to that paragraph which has a ID of para2. Now what we should see is it's going to add the yellow color to only these spans, and it's going to not it's going to just ignore the selections for these spans because they are not a sibling of a paragraph which has an ID of para2. Because it has an ID of para1, it's not going to style these three paragraphs. So let's verify if that's the case. Let me go back and refresh it. As you can see, it did not add the yellow color to these spans. So that's how we can narrow down our selections by adding a div and making the selectors very specific to a particular div or a paragraph or whatever. So we want to keep it very specific. Otherwise, it's going to mess around with the other uh, elements which do have the same convention. So we don't want to have that. So that's what is general sibling selector. So the difference is the adjacent sibling selector styles the immediate sibling, whereas general sibling selector styles all the siblings which match the criteria. Uh, so it's similar. Similarly, like in the previous tutorial, we discussed about descendant selector and child selector. The descendant selector is where it's going to add the styling to all the descendants, no matter at which child level they are at. It's going to add the color to the criteria, matching criteria. Whereas in the child selector, it's going to add it only to the next child level, which is not next child level, it's child level, which is the next level to the parent. It's not going to do or apply the styling to nested levels. So I hope that made sense. And we'll be talking about a few more topics in the next tutorial.